Empire are known for their gunpowder the world around, but honestly, even with Elspeth, they're hardly at the top of the firepower tier list these days. However, the Deithland Roster Overhaul is here to change that by providing them with an all-new roster chock full of more gunpowder than you can shake a plot at. So let's take a look at all the new units and if they're any good. And if you want a good way to avoid ads on these videos, it's by becoming a channel member. All the same videos with none of the ads, all for just $1 a month. Now, let's get into the roster. This mod focuses entirely on the roster overhaul, so the Empire's campaign is much the same, only alongside all of their regular units, the new ones are available in the same buildings. First up, we have the Gallo Dogs, which are the one and only unit of melee infantry. They're very similar to swordsmen, but drop a little defense and leadership to gain some speed and charge bonus. They also pick up a couple of abilities that inform exactly how they're supposed to be used. Firstly, they're expendable, so if they run away or get wiped out completely, the rest of your army won't really care, meaning they can be used as a meat shield with no real downside. And second, when they're losing in melee combat, they drop their own attack to gain melee damage reflection. Since their own damage is pretty low anyway, this means they'll chip away enemies whilst they die, so not a bad parting gift. Obviously, they're built to keep enemies still, whilst others do all the real damage, so as long as you bear that in mind, you should be fine. Now we come to the ranged infantry, and first up we have the Handguns Fume Corps. These are a short-range guns unit with decent armor-piercing damage and high rate of fire. Their damage isn't the highest, so chances are it'll take a few barrages to put away anything half decent. Combined with their low ammo, this means they'll likely run out before they can wipe out the enemy army, but that's really fair enough for something so cheap. In melee, they're okay with similar stats to spearmen, but of course you want to keep them shooting until they're out of ammo before you worry about that. Get them a good angle or a large target to shoot at, and keep them firing until they can't no more. Next, we have the Cinderwind Arbalists. These are a very bizarre unit, so let me break it down. They have a tiny unit size, no real melee prowess, and extremely low damage explosive missiles. However, they're imbued with the Incindered effect, dealing damage over time and dropping a large number of stats. As far as I can see, they're to be mainly used to debuff enemies with their curved firing arc and do a tiny bit of damage in the process. They cannot carry out battles and are also to be used as a support unit to weaken tougher enemies. The Danzigers also have a very small unit size but pack a significantly bigger punch. They have a short range, but within it deal massive amounts of armor-piercing damage, with barrages capable of stopping units dead in their tracks. They don't have the fastest rate of fire, but combined with their high ammo counts, they're pretty much guaranteed to never run out of ammo. Of course you want to keep them out of melee, but with their short range and flat firing arc, that can be a challenge. They'll need an off angle or something large to shoot at, otherwise they'll struggle to fire at all. Angle Spears have an even smaller unit size, but still manage to pack a pretty decent punch as long as you're against clumps of enemies. They have artillery class range, and within it can deal some very respectable explosive damage with a very slow fire rate. Their missiles first hang in the air like flares before launching towards their target like a predator missile, meaning they're a little bit odd to get the hang of without a wee bit of friendly fire occurring. However, their real power is in taking down buildings, against which they gain over 1000% bonus damage, meaning walls and gates don't stand a chance. A bit of a niche unit, but if you're struggling during sieges, they're not a bad pick. We also have the Hellbores, and finally we have a true carry unit. These lads have decent range, and even with their flat firing arc, they can still take relatively safe positions and land shots. And those shots come in 3 different flavours of pain. High explosive ammo deals massive explosive damage with very high base and armor piercing damage, allowing them to blow through clumps with ease. High explosive anti-large deals just as much explosive damage, but now deals some great impact damage against whatever they make impact with, making them great for large targets and single entities. And Airburst, which deals a lot less damage overall, but do great work versus flying targets to knock them out of the sky in no time. They're a great versatile unit that can take on pretty much anything, provided you keep them out of melee. The Mortar Musketeers are very similar to the Hellbores with one key difference. They swap the flat firing arc for a curved one, meaning they can fire from safety a lot easier, but do have to take into account travel time, making them easier to dodge. Other than that, they come with 2 new ammo types. Scattershot shortens their range but makes them into powerful shotgun units capable of blowing away approaching enemies. Cinderwind is pretty much the same as the Arbalest, so very little damage, but a powerful cocktail of debuffs, useful for weakening enemies with minimal risk of damage to anyone. A great alternative if you're struggling for sightlines, but slightly less carry potential. The Tiller Guns are pretty much just Wartblock Giselles from the Skaven, but even better. More range, more ammo, and of course more damage, all with half the entities. They deal very high armor piercing damage from an exceptionally long range, best used against large single entities to ensure all that damage is hitting a single health bar all at once. With Shield Breaker, not even missile defense is enough to save the target, so nowhere is safe. Of course they have a fairly flat firing arc, so need a good angle on their target, but with their preference for something large, that shouldn't be a problem. Axlock Rifles Dive Guard are pretty much just the Empire handgunners with some melee ability. They have the same range and damage with a little more ammo. Alongside this, they have a nice chunk of armor, decent melee stats, and even some weapon strength. They're not endgame line holders, but if you want a front line that can also shoot pretty well, then they'll do that job perfectly. Blaster Key Rifles Dive Guard drop a little defense and charge to gain some attack, base damage and ammo, but the main change is the multiple ammo types. They have their regular rifle shot, which is just the same as axe locks. Their Blaster Key drops their ammo but allows them to shotgun blast to fire a large number of less damaging projectiles, useful versus infantry. Another strong frontline option with a little more versatility. We also have Carbines and Shields Dive Guard. These have some slight buffs to defense and charge, but at the cost of a large chunk of range. They'll still deal some decent damage within their shot range, but are more focused on being line holders than dealing any real damage of their own. The ranged is more so there for a bit of added spice as enemies approach, rather than their main method of dealing damage. The Fuselax's Pyre Hulks are back to being a small entity count, but are fairly beefy boys to make up for it. In melee, they're pretty strong with very high armor, excellent melee stats, and even strong armor piercing damage with a great bonus versus large. On the missile side of things, they have a medium range with very high armor piercing damage, allowing them to pick targets apart, no problem. You'll want to focus on large targets to make the most of all their bonuses and non-explosive damage. Plus, with their firing arc and speed, it's about the only thing they can hit from safety. We also have Volley Gauntlets Pyre Hulks. These drop attack and armor to gain defense and weapon strength in melee. On the range side of things, their range is cut in half, but they gain very high damage, with 3 projectiles each dealing huge armor piercing damage. This makes them great versus elite infantry, as they can cut through waves of them in moments, especially with their fairly speedy reload. They're a great frontlines option with their excellent melee prowess and ability to see off most approaching enemies with ease. Plus, with their low range and speed, they're hardly going to be flankers. Next up, the Auto Dragon's Pyre Titans, dropping the entity count once again to become even beefier with extremely high armor but actually a drop in melee stats. However, their damage is still very high armor piercing, and with their increased speed, they can avoid combat if they really need to. On the range side of things, they have a nice high range with plenty of ammo and extremely high damage. Their volleys launch high numbers of very high armor piercing damage projectiles, with a bonus versus large, meaning not much can stand up to their focus. Infantry, single entities, and everything in between will feel the burn, so just fire away at whatever you fancy, and as long as they have a clear line of sight, they'll clean up. If all of this wasn't enough, they can also swap to shotgun mode, which drops their range and ammo along with much of their damage to gain shotgun projectiles, dealing a lot of damage to incoming clumps of enemies. We also have Blaze Mortars Pyre Titans. These drop a little melee power along with a lot of missile power to gain some added range and a curved firing arc. With this, they can rain explosive flaming power onto enemies from a safe distance, no problem. They can also choose to use Cinderwind Mortars if you want no damage and some debuffs, and they can swap to Flamethrower mode, which drops their range and ammo to massively increase their missile power with the titular Thrower of Flame. We also have Halberd Cannons Pyre Titans. These are the best of the Titans in melee with massive damage and defense, making them a real threat to most units. From a range, they deal very respectable armor piercing damage, best used versus large targets to make the most of that impact. Plus, with the flat firing arc, it's pretty much the only thing they'll be able to hit without a flank, which is actually fairly possible with their high speed. They can swap to melee mode to lose their ranged power and gain some slight buffs to melee stats, along with Executioner to wipe out enemies in no time. And finally, we have Zwei Shots and Shields Pyre Titans. These drop some melee stats from halberds whilst also dropping their missile stats. However, they can still deal decent damage from a medium range, with strong armor piercing best used versus larger targets. They can also swap to heavy buckshot to reduce their range and launch volleys of lower damage projectiles, making them great versus infantry. Lastly, they can use shield mode to lose their ranged power to gain a gold shield and some defense. If you need them to stay alive and they're in trouble, then it's a good choice. Next up, we have the one and only cavalry unit, the Chem Lancers. These are a decent early game cav unit, about on par with Empire Knights, with a little less charge and armor, but more damage and a bonus versus large. They also gain access to a couple of magic missiles for some added explosive and heavily debuffing damage. Plus, it also comes with this neat feature where it devours all of your frames. They want to charge around, focus on larger targets, and use those missiles to weaken their targets before impact. Sustained melee isn't really their bag, so keep them on the move and they'll get a lot more value and stay a lot less dead. We also have Drilling Guns Chem Lancers. These drop a lot of melee power from the regular Chem Lancers along with their magic missiles, but in return get some regular missiles. This comes in the form of 2 choices. Their shotguns come with high burst damage and lots of less damaging projectiles, adding up to some pretty devastating barrages, most effective versus clumps of infantry. The carbines drop the projectile count but up the damage, making them better versus single targets, where you want the damage focused on a smaller area. Both of these can be used on the move, making them excellent skirmishers versus any kind of enemy. Just keep them on the move and out of melee, and they're a pretty great and versatile unit. And lastly, we have the artillery and the war machines. First up, the mountain guns. Artillery are going to be a speedrun because almost all of them just sit there and shoot with no melee power, so strap on or strap in depending on your preference. These have a pretty short range for artillery, within which they deal fairly strong armor piercing damage with a straight firing arc. Of course, this is best used versus larger targets to make the most of that damage. They can also swap to Grape Shot, which drops the range further alongside the damage, but ups the projectiles, allowing them to be much more effective versus infantry. The Nell guns get a nice boost in power with a little more range. The extra power is mainly down to the double projectiles per cannon, but again, we're focusing on larger targets since this is some very high damage that no infantry in the game would get the most out of. You can swap to Grape Shot, which again drops range and damage to be more effective versus infantry. Or you can go with Chain Shot, which deals moderate damage over a decent range, but now also slows enemies, making it easier for other units to move in for the kill. Drake Biters are quite like the mountain guns, but with much more range and a little more damage. They're best used versus very large targets unless you swap to Grape Shot, in which case infantry are back on the menu. Culverins are pretty similar to Drake Biters, but with less range, ammo and damage per second. However, their barrages technically do more damage, they just reload a lot slower, so still aim for those large targets to get the most out of them, and use Grape Shot if you want to shoot at infantry. Plus, don't be scared to shoot at walls and gates to make the most of their 50% bonus versus structures. The Vindabane Crank Canyons drop a lot of range, going all the way down to that of some decent infantry. Their damage also takes a hit, but with their multiple projectiles, they're best used versus infantry, so this is still plenty to knock most approaching troops on the back foot. They can also swap to explosive rounds, some added area damage with strangely more range, so I'm not sure why you wouldn't always use them. We also have the armoured Vindabane Crank Cannons, the same but with lots of armour and some melee capabilities. Still, obviously avoid damage if at all possible, only now they will die slightly slower if you can't. The Auto Falcons have some decent range within which they deal very strong damage with high armour piercing, mild explosive power, and lots of shells per barrage. Best use is probably still large targets, but infantry would work too, so just pick whatever you fancy, despite what the bonus would have you believe. We also have the Armoured Auto Falcons, and wow, it's the same thing with armour, isn't it pretty? The Cinderbell Howitzers are back to having a very high range, and within that they deal armour-piercing explosive damage best used versus clumps of infantry. You can also swap to Cinderwind if you want no damage and some debuffs, but that's up to you. The Auto Dragons are back to fairly moderate range for artillery with absurdly high damage with armour-piercing and a lot of projectiles per barrage. Once again, strong versus infantry and large, so it all depends on what the most pressing threat is and what they can get an angle on. The Cofferglare Rocket Battery launches explosive missiles with a curved firing arc and poor accuracy, making them great versus large clumps of enemies where they essentially can't miss. They can also swap to Drake Catchers to massively slow flying targets, making them easier for other units to shoot out of the sky. Lastly, they can swap to Short Range mode, which drops their range but increases their shots per volley and reload speed for a faster fire rate when enemies are closing in. This also allows them to use Cinderwind for no damage and some debuffs. Next up, the Culverins Gotzon. This is basically a tank, albeit one with very limited melee power, so basically use it as an armoured artillery piece. The three variants have three different secondary ranged weapons that aren't on the stat card, so we're going to need to judge them based on names and vibes. All of them share the same main gun with high range and moderate damage with some okay armour piercing, but not the most. Use the explosive power to break up clumps of enemies, and they'll put up some decent numbers. The Culverins deal some decent armour-piercing damage from a moderate range for some added damage best used versus whatever they're shooting at because you can't decide. The Flamethrower deals great damage versus infantry with huge area of effect, but is a little risky with the friendly fire if your allies are anywhere close. And the Nell Guns provide some armour-piercing damage with plenty of projectiles, so are great versus infantry, but again, you can't aim them, so it doesn't matter. Now to wrap up with a mod review. Roster mods for me generally end up being fairly low impact unless they significantly change something about the campaign, like the Tigermen. If all you are offering is some new units, then chances are I'll probably only see a handful of them when I'm not auto-resolving everything I can. However, this mod really did blow my expectations out of the water. This is a full-size roster that could be its own faction, but instead it's stapled onto the Empire, meaning you have such a massive toy box that it can honestly feel a little overwhelming. However, the sheer quality and variety of these units is something to behold, and makes the experience worth any amount of hassle when it comes to navigating such a massive roster. Granted, almost all of these units are ranged focused, so the way you use them ends up being much the same, however each one has a specialty that makes them worth bringing depending on your situation. More than anything else, this has given me hope that battles might actually work in 40k, as even with every unit having some amount of ranged power, battles never felt idle. I was never sat waiting for enemies to walk into my guns, I was choosing targets and taking out threats to the backline as fast as I could to keep my main damage dealer shooting. I absolutely love the variety of units and firing modes as they make each unit feel different even if most of them are shooting something. From regular gunners to mortars to flamethrowers and more, each unit has a little quirk that you'll need to learn to get the most out of them. From a visual standpoint, these units all look fantastic. It reminds me a lot of Iron Harvest, especially with some of the later game mechs, but everything from the lowest infantry to the tankiest tank feel distinctly the Empire, which is extremely impressive. If you're an Empire fan and want some way to spice up your next campaign, then I really can't recommend this roster enough. If you're into playing most of your battles and want some spectacle that may be a little loose with the balance, then you should absolutely give it a go. If for no other reason, then this is as close as we'll get to 40k for quite a while. But what I want to know is, what do you think of the Deithland Empire roster? Are you a mech head, or do you reject this modernity in favour of a more traditional line of spears? Let me know in the comments below, like the video if you did, subscribe for more, and if you want more Warhammer 3 mod videos, then check out this one all about the fourth and quite possibly the strongest Celestial sibling.